Millionaire Edward Harrington thought nothing could escape his control. That night, in front of dozens of guests, he ridiculed the maid and her son, certain they could never contribute anything. But when an accident halted the party and even renowned engineers failed, it was the humiliated boy who stood up. The laughter died down, and what happened next left the millionaire speechless in front of everyone. In the pulsating heart of New York, where skyscrapers competed with the stars, stood the penthouse of Edward Harrington, a 47-year-old tycoon known as much for his wealth as for his arrogance. It was the chosen stage for a reception to seal a billion-dollar international contract. Crystal chandeliers reflected a golden glow on impeccably set marble tables, while waiters glided with silver trays, serving French champagne to guests dressed in haute couture. For Edward, it wasn't just a party. It was a chance to prove to the world that his empire was unrivaled. Among the servants, discreetly positioned near the ballroom's heavy curtains, was Clara Johnson, the 35-year-old maid who devoted every ounce of her energy to keeping the Harrington mansion in order. Though Edward never missed an opportunity to remind her that she was just the maid, Clara carried a quiet dignity, born of the struggles she had waged to support her son alone. That night, forced by circumstances, she had brought 13-year-old Liam, hidden backstage at the event. The boy remained quiet, almost invisible, with watchful eyes that captured details that escaped even the most experienced adults. Edward, however, barely noticed Clara's presence, except when he needed to reinforce his contempt. During the preparations, noticing a slightly out-of-place floral arrangement, he didn't miss the opportunity to sting her with sharp words. "A maid like you shouldn't know much anyway, she's never studied." The muffled laughter of some nearby guests echoed, compounding the woman's silent pain. Liam, hidden behind the curtain, heard every word. His heart sank, but he remained steadfast. Unbeknownst to him, that very night, the invisible boy would have the chance to turn humiliation into something much greater, and, in the process, silence the most powerful man in the room. Edward's words hung in the air like invisible blades, wounding not only Clara but also her son hidden in the shadows. Liam clenched his fists, feeling anger mix with helplessness. It wasn't the first time he'd heard the millionaire humiliate his mother, reducing her to worthlessness. For him, each insult was a cruel reminder that, in the Harrington world, people like them were invisible. Even so, Clara stood erect, eyes downcast, silently replacing the flowers. Her strength lay in her calm, but inside, shame burned like fire. In the ballroom, the guests laughed loudly, raising their glasses, oblivious to the minor drama that had just occurred. To them, Edward was an impeccable host, a brilliant businessman who knew how to control any situation. But behind the mask of sophistication, he cultivated a perverse pleasure in displaying power over the weakest. That evening would be remembered for its grandeur, and he would not allow anything to deviate from the script he had planned. Liam, hidden, took a deep breath, trying to contain his indignation. He knew his mother deserved respect, not stifled laughter. And, without realizing it, the opportunity to change that story was already looming on the horizon. The glitter of the chandeliers and the sound of classical music couldn't hide for long the fact that something unexpected was about to happen. Something no guest in an expensive suit could have predicted. As guests toasted in French and English, Edward strode through the hall with the poise of a monarch secure in his throne. His deep, authoritative voice echoed among the gilded chandeliers as he recited astronomical figures from his latest investments. He gestured like a trained actor, earning laughter and rehearsed applause from an audience that, for the most part, was there more to be seen than to hear. Each sentence about record profits was accompanied by looks of admiration and also of disguised envy, for everyone knew that in that crystal hall there were not only allies, there were also smiling adversaries, waiting for the slightest slip-up to topple an empire. For Edward, maintaining an image of perfection was more important than any truth. He was the architect of his own legend, and he believed that nothing in that space could threaten his authority. Clara moved among the tables, silent as ever, straightening the impeccably aligned tablecloths, discreetly changing crystal glasses, and picking up small slips that went unnoticed by the elite. Pretending not to hear the still-present whispers about her supposed ignorance, she repeated the routine with the serenity of someone carrying the weight of a lifetime on her shoulders. But inside, her heart pounded heavily. How many more times would she endure the mockery without exploding? With each humiliation, she remembered the sleepless nights working double shifts, the cold she endured on crowded buses, and Liam's dreamy eyes, unwilling to be lost amidst the hardships. Looking at her son, hidden near the curtains with a small stolen dessert plate, she felt a mixture of fear and pride. His gaze wasn't one of submission. It was one of someone who saw the world differently, refusing to believe that wealth defined human worth. And this restless spirit, though it frightened her, was also her secret hope. The gold-adorned wall clock was striking 9 when the unexpected began to creep in. A metallic hum ran through the room, as subtle as a whisper, confused by the melodious sound of the orchestra in the background. Some guests frowned, looking around, but soon returned to their conversations, believing it to be merely an irrelevant technical detail. Edward, absorbed in his own narrative, didn't notice, but Liam did. His alert ears picked up the irregularity, and his agile mind associated the noise with something larger. He rose slightly from the chair he'd been hiding in, his eyes fixed on the direction of the main elevator. The boy couldn't quite explain it, but he felt a shiver run down his spine, as if the air warned that something much more serious was about to happen. The perfect evening, built on crystal and vanity, was about to reveal its first cracks. The metallic hum turned into a dull crack, like thunder trapped inside the building, and suddenly the orchestra fell silent for a few seconds, startled. The sound was coming from the main elevator, the one that had transported most of the guests to the top floor. One of the waiters, pale-faced, ran to the control panel and noticed the lights were flickering erratically. Then a muffled scream echoed from inside the shaft. Someone was trapped. The revelation spread like wildfire among those present. The investors, who had previously displayed polite smiles, began exchanging worried glances, and a growing murmur filled the luxurious ballroom. Suddenly, the entire aura of power and perfection built by Edward began to crumble in the face of an unexpected technical failure. On the other side, behind the elevator's iron door, stood one of the evening's most influential investors, German Kurt Reinhardt, and his 8-year-old daughter, trapped in her father's arms, panicked. The girl's desperate banging against the door echoed like a punch to the hearts of those listening, but Edward showed no compassion. His expression hardened, and instead of seeking solutions, he raised his voice to disguise his tension. "This is just a technical problem, nothing more. My engineers will fix it in a moment." However, the artificial tone convinced no one. Clara, watching from the sidelines, felt a chill run down her spine as she heard the child's screams. Maternal instinct tightened her chest, but she was powerless to act. She could only watch her boss's embarrassment grow under the suspicious gaze. As technicians were rushed in, the panel insisted on remaining dead, displaying flashing lights and strange codes that no one could decipher. Nervousness filled the room. Glasses were left on tables, plates forgotten half-eaten, and even the music stopped. The gala atmosphere had given way to a stifling atmosphere. Liam, motionless near the curtains, silently analyzed every detail. His eyes scanned the exposed cables on the side of the panel, the rapidly appearing and disappearing error messages, the buttons that seemed to disobey every command. There was logic in this chaos, something no one else noticed. His heart raced not just with fear, but with a dawning certainty. He could do something about it. The entire room was already filled with an air of unease. Some guests murmured in hushed tones, fearing for the child trapped inside the elevator, while others wondered how such a powerful man could be incapable of ensuring the safety of his own penthouse. Edward paced back and forth, a discreet sweat dripping down his forehead, though he tried to hide it with a forced smile. He demanded efficiency from the engineers present, but each attempt resulted in more failures. When a spark escaped from one of the panels, the audience let out a collective sigh, and a foreign investor quipped, "Billion-dollar luxury, but elevators that don't work." The blow struck Edward like an invisible knife. To protect himself from embarrassment, he sought an easy target: Clara. Noticing her watching from the sidelines, clutching a cloth tightly as she twisted it between her nervous hands, Edward raised his voice with calculated cruelty. "You there! Get back to work. This kind of problem is for educated men, not for maids who can barely read contracts." The muffled chuckles of some guests echoed, not because they found it genuinely funny, but because they were accustomed to laughing at the host to avoid upsetting him. Clara lowered her eyes, trying to compose herself, but her face flushed with embarrassment. In the back of the room, Liam felt his blood boil. Every word was like a blade against his mother. He no longer saw just a millionaire in trouble. He saw a man trying to mask his incompetence with cowardly humiliations. The engineers, under pressure, repeated the same commands to no avail. The girl's screams inside the elevator grew more desperate, echoing off the walls of the hall and silencing any attempt at music or conversation. The guests no longer laughed. Many exchanged looks of indignation. Edward's prestige, carefully built over the years, began to crack before everyone's eyes. Liam, hidden behind the curtain, took a deep breath. He watched the electronic panel as if deciphering a puzzle. Small details leaped out at him. The sequence of blinks, the irregular pattern of the buttons, the system's delayed response. He still didn't know how, but something inside him screamed that the solution was there, and that no one would see it again if he didn't do something. Liam watched silently as the room descended into chaos, but unlike adults who saw only despair, his eyes, trained in curiosity, noticed hidden patterns. Since childhood, he had been in the habit of disassembling broken radios, observing old engines, and reading technical manuals found in public libraries, things his mother had never fully understood but respected. Now, standing before the elevator panel, which was blinking irregularly, he realized the problem wasn't just in the software, as the engineers insisted, but also in an overheating problem on the secondary line, betrayed by the barely perceptible smell of burning plastic and the high-pitched hum of the circuitry. The technicians typed and repeated commands like someone battling a ghost, while Edward, increasingly irritated, tried to save face by offering financial rewards that sounded more like disguised desperation. Clara, on the side, gripped the service cloth so tightly that her fingers trembled, noticing her son's unusual attention to every detail. For a moment, she locked eyes with Liam and wanted to beg him not to get involved. But the gleam in his eyes made it clear he'd already made up his mind. Her heart sank, torn between the fear of seeing him humiliated and the strange feeling that maybe, just maybe, he'd seen something no one else there had. Liam took a deep breath, as if seeking courage in his own silence, and then stepped forward, leaving behind the safety of the curtains that hid him. The sound of his shoes on the marble floor seemed to echo louder than it should have, drawing curious glances and muffled laughter from some guests who were surprised to see a boy his age amidst such a luxurious setting. He walked until he stopped in front of the panel and, with a firmness that surprised even himself, raised his voice for the first time that night. Don't move for 30 seconds. The technicians looked at each other in disbelief, and Edward immediately turned to the scene, his eyes flashing with impatience, ready to crush the audacity. But Liam didn't back down. He took another deep breath and said clearly, "I can handle this, sir." The room erupted in laughter. The millionaire laughed sarcastically, and even some investors joined in the mockery, finding the scene absurd. But standing before the panel, the maid's son didn't seem intimidated. He kept his eyes fixed on the blinking buttons and the side sensor partially obscured by the decorative flowers. Clara's heart nearly stopped. With each passing second, the tension grew, and everyone waited only for Edward's order to expel the boy. But there was something in Liam's posture, something in the calm and confidence in his voice, that began, albeit subtly, to silence some of the more fragile laughter. Edward wasted no time in turning the moment into a spectacle. Still holding the crystal glass, he took 2 steps forward and let out a laugh so loud it drowned out even the blinking buttons on the elevator panel. "Look at this!" he exclaimed, pointing at Liam as if he were part of a cruel joke. "Now we have little mechanical geniuses, the children of maids, trying to solve what trained engineers can't." The room erupted in new laughter, some nervous, some just fawning, and Clara closed her eyes for a moment, as if she wanted to disappear. Liam, however, remained steadfast. The blush of embarrassment didn't rise to his face because his mind was too busy analyzing every detail of the failure everyone ignored. The panel lights flashed at regular intervals, revealing that the system was stuck in a failed reboot cycle. He knew that if he could break the loop for just a few seconds, he could force the sensor to cool down and release the safety lock. While Edward jeered and the guests laughed, the boy remained alert, watching like a hunter waiting for the right moment to strike. It was a stark contrast. On one side, the millionaire's arrogance underpinned by mockery. On the other, the silent calm of a boy with the certainty in his eyes that he wasn't there to play. The room didn't know it yet, but the contempt fueling the laughter would soon turn to absolute shock. The laughter echoed through the hall like a rehearsed chorus, but it lasted less than Edward expected. Gradually, it dissolved into uncomfortable murmurs, as if something invisible loomed over everyone and was impossible to ignore. The sound of a child crying inside the elevator cut through the air again, high-pitched, desperate, reminding everyone that the scene was not funny. German Kurt Reinhardt, trapped inside, began banging on the door loudly, shouting in English and German for someone to do something. Suddenly, the awkwardness fell like a curtain over the guests, and the laughter gave way to uneasy looks. Edward, sensing the change in the mood, hardened his expression. He tried to regain control, ordering the engineers again to fix this immediately. But the order sounded frail, lacking any real authority. Clara looked at her son with her heart in her throat. She wanted to scream for him to come back, to not expose himself to this massacre, but the courage in Liam's eyes paralyzed her. He didn't seem to hear the laughter or the insults. His senses were completely focused on the dashboard, as if the world around him had disappeared. Liam moved even closer to the system, crouching down to examine the exposed cables and the small fan that was supposed to cool the module. He felt the hot air escaping like the blast of a furnace, and in that instant he was absolutely certain of his analysis. It wasn't just a software problem. It was a crash caused by overheating. With impressive calm for someone his age, he began to explain clearly, not to Edward, but to everyone who would listen. The system is rebooting itself because the temperature sensor is blocked. Until it cools down, the elevator won't release. The silence that followed was almost absolute. Some investors frowned, surprised by the boy's technical clarity. Others looked at Edward, waiting for a reaction, but the millionaire was stunned, somewhere between anger and disbelief. For the first time that night, he couldn't laugh. One of the technicians, embarrassed by his own inability, risked checking the spot Liam had indicated. When he touched the sensor, he hurriedly withdrew his hand, as if he had touched a hot iron, confirming the boy was right. A murmur of shock ran through the room. Edward still tried to assert himself, shaking his head and saying it was just a coincidence. But the weight of the truth was already beginning to suffocate him. Liam, without waiting for permission, asked for a glass of ice water. A waiter hesitantly brought it to him. The boy wet the cloth his mother was carrying and applied it to the exact spot on the circuit, muffling the heat. The lights on the panel flashed in a different sequence, as if the system had finally found a way to free itself. Everyone's eyes widened, trapped in anticipation. It was as if the fate of that night depended on the next second, and would be decided by the hands of the maid's son. The entire room was suspended in silence as Liam gently pressed the damp cloth to the overheated sensor. The water droplets evaporated almost instantly, releasing a subtle hiss that made some guests hold their breath. The panel, which until then seemed dead in a cycle of failures, blinked differently, slower and more coordinated, as if trying to come back to life. The engineers looked at each other in disbelief, and one of them muttered, This might work." Edward, red with anger, raised his hand as if to stop the boy from continuing, but was interrupted by the child's cries inside the elevator, now louder and more desperate. The millionaire swallowed hard, and for a moment his arrogance seemed to give way under the moral pressure of the situation. Everyone knew the boy was doing more than any expert there had ever managed. Suddenly, a metallic click echoed through the hall, and the panel emitted a long beep, signaling a complete reset. The elevator lights came on steadily, and seconds later, the door slowly opened, revealing Kurt Reinhardt carrying his daughter in his arms, pale and sobbing, but unharmed. The audience burst into spontaneous applause. Not for Edward, not for the engineers, but for Liam. The boy took a step back, embarrassed by the sudden attention, but his achievement had already become the center of the evening. Clara clapped her hands to her mouth, tears streaming uncontrollably. Her heart felt like it was about to burst with pride and relief. As Kurt thanked her in German, hugging his daughter tightly, he turned to Edward with a hard expression and a cutting sentence. "If it weren't for your employee, tonight would have ended in tragedy." The weight of the accusation fell like lead on the millionaire, who felt the ground give way beneath his feet. For the first time, there was no laughter to sustain him, only judgmental looks. Liam, the boy he had ridiculed minutes before, was now the unexpected hero of the evening. And in that moment, in the hearts of everyone present, something changed irreversibly. Edward forced a stiff smile, but inside he felt the crushing weight of shame. He, the impeccable host, had been exposed before international investors as a man incapable of solving his own problems within his luxurious penthouse. Applause rang out not for him, but for the maid's son who had dared contradict him. Trying to regain control, Edward raised his voice, clapping his hands to drown out the din of praise directed at Liam. Well done, gentlemen. See how even youth can have beginner's luck." The tone was artificial, laden with irony, but few laughed. Most of the guests remained serious, some even crossing their arms in disapproval, as if tired of the spectacle of arrogance. Kurt Reinhardt, still holding his daughter, gave a sharp look that made it clear. No cheap apology would erase what had just happened. Clara, motionless in the corner, watched her boss struggle to maintain his composure. She knew Edward would never admit he was wrong, especially in front of an audience that represented prestige and million-dollar contracts. But what surprised her was seeing Liam standing beside the panel, head held high, unafraid. The boy seemed unfazed by the millionaire's derogatory words. There was a serenity within him that contrasted with all the tension in the air. Clara clutched the still wet cloth to her chest, trying to hold back her tears. She knew that moment would be etched in her memory forever. The night her son, so often invisible, had become greater than any humiliation. As the waiters scurried to rearrange the room and the orchestra tried unsuccessfully to resume the music, Edward approached Liam with heavy steps, keeping the forced smile on his lips. "So you think you're a genius, boy?" he said quietly, but audibly enough for several nearby guests to hear. "You may be good at cheap tricks, but here, in the real world, true knowledge is for businessmen, not for the sons of maids." The phrase echoed like poison in the air, and this time it didn't elicit laughter. Instead, it generated uncomfortable looks, some even of explicit disapproval. Edward didn't realize it, but his attempt to belittle the boy only deepened his own downfall. The contrast between his arrogance and Liam's calm courage could no longer be ignored, and that silent battle was only beginning. Edward's venomous comment hung in the air like toxic smoke, but, contrary to his expectations, it found no audience willing to laugh. On the contrary, the hall, until then accustomed to fawning over the host's every gesture, reacted with a heavy silence. Some guests looked away, uncomfortable with the gratuitous cruelty, while others exchanged expressions of open disapproval. Kurt Reinhardt, still holding his daughter, raised his firm, clear voice. "Businessman Mr. Kingsley, no talent when they see it. What your chief engineer couldn't achieve, this boy did in minutes." The impact of the sentence was immediate, echoing like a sentence before everyone. Clara felt her chest swell with pride upon hearing the unexpected defense, and discreet tears escaped her eyes. For the first time, Edward stood naked before the elite itself. No excuse, no charm, no sarcastic laughter could erase what everyone had witnessed. Meanwhile, Liam remained motionless, his gaze fixed, without needing to utter a single word. He was a contrast in flesh and blood. A boy with nothing to lose, fearlessly facing a millionaire obsessed with losing nothing. The investors murmured among themselves, some commenting that they had seen more practical intelligence in the boy than in many professionals hired for a fortune. Others reminded them that wealth without humility was ruin waiting to happen, and the whispers grew, forming a wave that Edward could not contain. The sound was no longer of flattery, but of judgment. Clara watched, astonished, the transformation of the environment. From a festive stage to a silent courtroom where the boss's power crumbled, brick by brick. Edward tried to regain control by raising his glass in a toast, but no one joined in. The gesture, which would normally have been enough to draw the entire room, fell flat, exposing his fragility. A flush of anger rose to his face, and he glared at Liam with hatred, as if the boy were to blame for tarnishing his impeccable reputation. But without realizing it, he had already lost. The attention was no longer on him, but on the frail boy in plain clothes who had just saved a life. What had begun as a night of ostentation had turned into a night of revelations, and the audience had already chosen its side. It remained to see how far Edward would sink before admitting what he feared most, that he was no longer the center of his own party. The tension was already unbearable when Edward, overcome by wounded pride, blurted out words that should never have been said. He turned to Clara, pointing his finger at her as if searching for a scapegoat for his own shame. "This is what happens when you allow maids to bring their children near rooms that don't belong to them," he shouted, his voice thick with contempt. The impact was immediate. The entire room fell silent, not in respect, but in absolute shock. Even the waiters stopped moving, holding trays aloft, as if time had frozen. The words not only attacked Clara and Liam, but insulted the intelligence of the guests who had just witnessed the opposite of what he had said. Edward didn't understand, but he was digging his own ruin with every syllable. Clara felt her face burn, as if she'd been slapped in front of everyone. But, contrary to Edward's expectations, she didn't lower her head. She gripped the still damp cloth tightly between her fingers and stood tall, even though her eyes betrayed the pain. Liam, at her side, didn't blink. The boy's courage came not from boldness, but from the conviction that he was right, that he had seen what no one else had. The contrast was so stark that some investors began to whisper openly, unafraid of being overheard, "He's lost control." Another, more forcefully, added, "Men who don't know how to recognize value don't deserve to lead." Words that reached Edward's ears like knives, but now could no longer be contained. In a desperate attempt to reassert his authority, Edward raised his voice again and ordered security to remove Liam from the room immediately. But before anyone could move, Kurt Reinhardt stepped forward, his daughter still in his arms, and said firmly, "No one touches that boy. If anyone deserves to leave here, Mr. Kingsley, it's not him." The weight of the sentence fell upon everyone like an indisputable verdict. What remained of Edward's support evaporated in seconds. The gazes that had previously been divided between respect and fear now turned to Liam and Clara with recognition and solidarity. Edward, breathless and unresponsive, felt the party he had planned to reinforce his power transform into the public stage for his greatest humiliation. The room, which just minutes before had exuded luxury and ostentation, now had the air of a courtroom. Edward looked around and realized, with horror, that those gazes that had always flattered him now pierced him like sharp knives. His business partners, accustomed to seeing him as the image of infallible success, whispered among themselves with expressions of disapproval. A Japanese investor, who had always revered him in public, shook his head silently, while an American tycoon, known for being his ally in major projects, turned to another guest and muttered, "This man sees no further than his own ego." The comment did not go unnoticed, spreading like wildfire. Edward, trying to compose himself, straightened his jacket and raised his voice to speak of contracts, dividends, and promising futures, but there was no one who listened with credibility. Meanwhile, Liam stood there, small in stature but towering in presence. He didn't seek attention, didn't demand anything. He simply stood his ground, his eyes still fixed on the panel he'd deciphered minutes before. Clara watched her son and, for the first time, saw not just a curious boy, but someone with a courage capable of changing the course of that evening. The contrast between Liam's serene silence and Edward's arrogant verbiage was so stark that the guests no longer needed proof to decide who deserved respect. Some even discreetly approached Clara, offering looks of solidarity that made her feel, for the first time in a long time, seen not as a servant, but as the mother of someone extraordinary. Edward felt the mood slipping completely from his grasp and, in a desperate move, raised his glass again, attempting to start another toast. His voice echoed throughout the room, but no one joined in. The sound of the crystal hitting the empty space sounded pathetic, almost painful. He swallowed hard, but before he could compose himself, one of the evening's most influential investors stood up, walked over to Liam, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Kid, what you did here isn't luck. It's vision. And vision is what builds empires." The sentence fell like a final sentence. The room erupted in applause, this time unanimous and genuine, and Edward felt his world crumble as he realized he had lost not only the party, but also the respect that sustained his empire. Edward stood in the center of the room, his glass still raised, as if expecting the applause filling the room to suddenly turn to him. But the sound no longer belonged to him. It was Liam who occupied that invisible space of authority, and the guests now looked at him with genuine admiration. The millionaire tried to force a smile, but his face betrayed him, flushed with anger and embarrassment, his hands trembling slightly. The security guards waited discreetly, but they didn't dare move after Kurt's veiled order not to touch the boy. The scene was cruel for Edward. In his own home at his luxurious party, he was no longer the host, but merely a shadow ignored by the crowd. Clara, nearby, could hardly believe her eyes. For years she had swallowed humiliation, listened to Edward's venomous remarks about ignorant maids, and borne the weight of contempt to support her family and provide a future for her son. Now, on this night that had all the potential to be another painful one, she saw the situation reverse before her eyes. It wasn't she who had to stand up to her boss, but the very boy he despised. Liam remained silent, without arrogance, simply standing, still dressed in his simple clothes, as if unable to grasp the magnitude of the impact he was causing. Clara felt her chest swell with pride and, at the same time, relief. For the first time, she didn't feel invisible. Edward, for his part, desperately searched for any supportive glance, but found none. Those who had previously vied to offer him a toast now avoided him, as if his mere presence were toxic. The millionaire was alone in his own territory, and the loneliness weighed more heavily on him than any financial loss. He was like a king who, still crowned, discovers the throne is empty and no one believes in his authority anymore. His voice, once so respected, now sounded like a distant echo, unable to hold attention. The party, which he imagined would be the height of his glory, had become the stage for his most humiliating downfall. And the most painful thing was knowing that the person responsible for this turn of events was not a powerful rival, but the son of the maid he swore was incapable of anything great. Edward still tried to maintain his poise, but inside he felt like a man about to collapse. Cold sweat trickled down the back of his neck, and every round of applause aimed at Liam felt like a hammer blow to his already cracked pride. The millionaire, accustomed to dominating gatherings with a mere raise of his eyebrows, now found not a single soul willing to return his bow. Every glance that passed his way carried a silent judgment, and the realization that his mask had slipped began to suffocate him. He straightened his jacket, cleared his throat, and tried once again to assert himself. "Gentlemen, let's not forget who really organized this evening. This party, this building, this empire." But his voice wavered, sounded hollow, and was soon drowned out by the murmur of the guests, who simply ignored him. Clara, motionless in her corner, watched silently, as if witnessing the collapse of a giant. For years, she had watched him parade around with his arrogance, mocking her condition and humiliating the boy who was now celebrated. And although her heart still pounded with fear for her son, she felt within her a strange sense of justice being served before everyone. Liam, for his part, sought neither revenge nor glory. He remained silent, his expression serene and mature for a man of only 13. There was a gleam of understanding in his eyes. He knew he needed to say nothing more. He had already proven his worth, and his silence spoke louder than any speech. Edward, cornered, finally realized what he had always refused to admit. True power lay not in the wealth he displayed, nor in the contracts he signed, but in the ability to inspire genuine respect. And in that room he had lost exactly that. He tried to look Liam in the eye, but he couldn't hold the boy's gaze, as if he were reflected in a mirror showing him all the flaws he had spent his life hiding. For the first time in years, Edward found no answers, no excuses, no jokes. Only the heavy silence of someone forced to face their own truth. An unprecedented sense of vulnerability enveloped him, and the man who had always mocked the weakness of others began to taste the bitterness of his own downfall. The hall seemed different. The lights reflected off the gleaming marble, but they no longer illuminated Edward's glory. but rather the unexpected strength of a boy who had transformed a night of luxury into a lesson. The millionaire remained motionless, staring into the emptiness of his own powerlessness, while Liam, standing, was surrounded by looks of respect and admiration. Kurt Reinhardt approached and, with his daughter now calmer in his arms, bowed before the boy in gratitude. "Today you saved more than one life," he said solemnly. "You saved this night from being remembered as a tragedy." The silence that followed was broken by even louder applause, reverberating off the walls as if the entire mansion were applauding the boy. Clara, overcome with emotion, pressed her hands to her chest and let the tears fall freely. She never imagined that one day she would see her son rise before so many powerful men and emerge greater than them all. Edward tried to open his mouth, but no words came out. The pride that had always sustained him now weighed like a chain on his shoulders. What could he say? That he had been the one who had belittled the boy? That he had ridiculed his mother? That he had denied them, from the very beginning, their very right to be there? Nothing would hold water against what they had all witnessed. For the first time, Edward realized that wealth does not buy true respect, nor silence the voice of courage. His gaze met Liam's for a brief moment, and unable to bear the boy's calm firmness, he looked away in silence. It was his most painful defeat, not against a business rival, but against the boy he had always considered invisible. Liam, however, didn't smile in triumph or seek boasting. He simply bowed his head in respect and returned to his mother's side, as if everything he had done was natural. For him, there was no grandeur in fixing what was broken, only the simple truth that someone needed to see what others ignored. And in that moment, everyone realized what Edward never understood. Greatness lies not in titles, money, or luxury, but in the courage to act when no one believes you. The boy who had been forbidden to set foot in that room had become the hero who silenced the millionaire himself. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel now, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any transformative videos, and, of course, leave a like, because that really helps the channel continue to bring more moving stories like this. Thank you so much for your support.